industry. We'll talk about some of our stats for export and our local retail, about the fashion accessory makers of the Philippines, with some information also about our local footwear industry. Next slide, please. So there are two types of textile in the Philippines. That would be our artisan textile and our commercial textiles, working with our textile mills. The artisan textiles, known as Artela, there are 14 to 17 million indigenous people belonging to 110 ethno-linguistic groups, which would include Kalinga, Gadang, Yakan. 33% are in Northern Luzon, 61% are in Mindanao, and the rest are in Visayas. Some of the tela that we would have would be Abel, Piña, the Abaca that's used in Tinalak, Husi, and Hablon. Our handloom fabrics would be Abaca, pineapple, Piña silk, cotton, bamboo, and we're also known for our natural dyes. So the challenge here is that we need to protect our indigenous technology, and also protect the handloom and backstrap weavers, because this is part of our culture and the definition of who we are also as Filipino. To improve, not just to protect, but to also improve. So perhaps the ask here with government is to be able to protect our artisan workers, and to provide them with opportunities to be able to protect their intellectual property, and to be able to sell in the local and worldwide market. With commercial textile mills in the 1950s, there was a series of deliberate efforts to foster industrial growth in the Philippines. There were three big textile mills. And in 1959, the Philippines had actually reached the national requirement for textile cotton, which means that we were self-sustaining. We had cultivation of raw cotton, spinning into yarn, weaving into cloth, bleaching and dyeing, knitting and hosiery mills, industrial textile and garments manufacturers. But at its peak in the 1960s, we had fully integrated mills. As I mentioned, we had spinning, knitting, dyeing. We produced everything, but until the garments. And then we had our quota system. But then problems had happened as we had opened our markets, because with the import liberalization, there was with the import liberalization, there was an influx of cheaper fabrics, and that was something uh, that was something that companies had preferred, because it would be more cost effective for their business. And so the challenge here now is to support our local textile mills, so we can be fully integrated again, if that is a possibility, and have our local industry support our textile mills and our tala also, our local industry, and hopefully even our export industry, since with Conwep, the textile that comes into bonded warehouses, we're just known for the labor, when in fact maybe we can supply also the textile here from the Philippines as we develop the industry. There is a law called the RA 9242, which we will be discussing more at length later on. And the priority of the law is to use the tropical fabrics for government and public officials, and it enjoins CSC, the ADOST to work together. And this is something that we would like to revisit in terms of some of the items that would be there in the law, so it would be more flexible to allow more artisan and commercial textile mills to be able to supply uh, the local business for government. Next slide, please. To talk about our losses, we want to talk about our gains the next time we meet with you. Okay, there was an 80% loss with the designers who were part of the Fashion Design Council of the Philippines, the Cebu Fashion Councils, the loss in business of 85% post-COVID. We have the 90% loss of from the other fashion groups. And from the Philippine Footwear Federation, we had found out that that in 1994 uh, there were 503 houses or artisan houses that were registered with them, and now there are only 60 after the pandemic or during the pandemic. But of note, in the 1980s, there were 3,600 uh, houses of fashion of footwear producers in Marikina. So this is a huge jump, and we need to find out what had happened and how we will be able to support the footwear industry again. We will be inviting the Footwear Federation to talk at another time during one of our discussions with Congress in July. Next slide, please. So industry losses, as I said, as part of our coalition, we also have our creative services. There's an 80% drop across the board. And we are very grateful to Congress and its initiatives working with NLEC and with the gig industry to be able to assist our workforce in this area. But please note that only 35% of the workforce has been preserved since March 2020, and they've been looking for other opportunities. Next slide, please. So when we talk about textiles, we talk about where we were and what had happened. As Yusek Fita had mentioned, we have become very fragmented, and there have been fast fashion proliferation, and also an issue of designer replication and knockoffs. Next slide, please. Again, stats of the Philippine textile industry, and then we see the drop. Next slide, please. Where are garments? It's been the industry has continued with the downward trend, so we need to be able to arrest this and see what kind of measures need to be done both for private and government. Next slide, please. From this slide, which was shown already to Congress before, what is noteworthy is that there is there's a high of the export of the footwear products, but also a huge demand for footwear products. But this huge demand isn't coming with the local market. It's coming from the importation of cheaper shoes. So is there a way for us to study how to promote Filipino footwear and Filipino products, and not just with a Buy Filipino type of program? So maybe that's something that we could study all together. Next slide, please. These figures are from BOI and also from Conweb. So we can see the increase, but this is an increase because of subcontractor work in the Philippines. But when we take a look at our actual leather producers, they have decreased. There are only two big leather producers, Chelsea Leather and Valenzuela Tannery, that we were advised of, and we'll be inviting them to the next hearings. Next slide, please. For accessories, there's both fine jewelry and costume jewelry. We have all been greatly affected. We'll have more of a report on this with FAMPH later on with our colleague Gina Nebridati. Next slide, please. As you can see with our performance, there has been a great decrease for exports of our fine jewelry. For our footwear, these figures came from export also, but subcontracting work. So it's not leather goods that come from the Philippines. Again, subcontracting work that has been decreasing. We have also, for our total exports, you can see there was an increase in 2019 and a decline because of our uh, because of our pandemic. What is of note is that there is a the US GSP has expired in 2020. So there has to be a renegotiation with the US government. So that's something that we can take up at another time so we can protect not just our subcontractors, but maybe also our brands and our other producers that would like to enter other markets. Next slide, please. For the Philippine retail situation, the figures that we have are only they're only indicative of some of two brands that we spoke to. One is a Filipino designer who's also a fashion retailer who experienced 70% decline from Jan and for their local retail uh, year on year they had a 30% they're still 30% from last year. From a Filipino owned mass market retailer, they registered a 70% decline from 2019 to 2020. So there hasn't been any substantial growth or improvement. Next slide, please. The figures that we had gotten, we requested figures from the Philippine Retailers Association and also from PCCI, but they gave us figures from the Philippine Franchise Association as part of an example of their members. Of their members, only 54.8% come from fashion, and they employ 2 million, and they have a contribution in retail and service and food. Here, their business impact, they had 50% losses in 20, they expect 50% losses in 2020. They are worried about a recession. 60% have displaced their employees, and 70% of their members say that they need 1 million to 20 million to normalize their operations. Next slide, please. Most of the franchise operators are actually in the malls. So this is the information that we're able to get. They are able to get, they had 50 to 75% decrease in sales. They reported 50 to 75% in decrease in store visits. They have negative cash flow and increased cost of business and increased cost of raw materials. Next slide. We have among our group that we're talking to, we have the Confederation of Export Manufacturers, and these are the brands that are being manufactured in the Philippines. Next slide. I'd like to ask my colleague, Noreen Bautista, to present some of the data about the digital consumption that had happened through the years and especially during the pandemic. Thank you, Noreen.
Thank you, Ms. Carissa. So as you can see, digital consumption has really been increasing. This is something, especially in Southeast Asia, even compared to our Western counterparts, the boom of digital is really skyrocketing here, especially among mobile consumers. Next slide, please. So this is the data from e-commerce in the Philippines, increased adoption of online as channel for shopping across markets. There's a 60 million increase in the digital consumers from 2018 to 2020. 96% already has access to the internet in their smartphones. And there's $85 billion worth of value in terms of digital payments in Southeast Asia. 308 million people in Southeast Asia have access to Facebook every day as of the first quarter of 2020. Next slide, please. Right. So as you can see, the e-commerce is a space that shows opportunity for this whole industry to really rebound, because the growth of e-commerce is really skyrocketing, driven especially by online marketplaces like Lazada, Shopee, to name a few. Next slide, please. All right, so you can see here the percent value of growth of e-commerce by channel and category. Mobile is definitely strong. That's why it's really important for brands to transition to being mobile friendly on e-commerce. So that includes really trying to make sure your interface is set up to be viewed in the mobile phone, because that really is the high penetration rate. Cross-border e-commerce is also high in terms of the channel. You have also Filipino merchants retailing for other marketplaces abroad like Amazon and even Alibaba. And that's really where the growth is. If we are able to digitize our MSMEs and our fashion industry, there's huge potential for cross-border e-commerce. Next slide, please. All right, and then I turn it over to the Conweb or the data. Ms. Carissa?
Yes. Okay. Also would like to mention for the growth in our digital that uh, when we had spoken to Zalora that 20% of their digital sales for fashion was actually coming from the Philippines. And so, but then there was growth that they were looking in growth in other areas also for home. So this is a space that we can explore, not just for e-commerce platforms, but then for B2C, for direct to from consumer, yeah, for business direct to consumer, in terms of like sales with Instagram for and Facebook, for online selling and different e-commerce platforms. So for the confederation of the Conweb, we on the slide you can see the figures that were mentioned earlier also for a year on year, but this would be in bar form. Next slide, please. I would like to turn over the presentation to our colleague Gina Nebridati to talk about the fashion group and its membership profile and its experiences during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Carissa. Good afternoon, Kong Tof and esteemed members of Congress, and to our